Good morning and welcome back to Goshen Church Online. If you will, go ahead and open up your Bible to Mark chapter 5 this morning. Today we're going to be spending our time focusing on verses 21 through 43. The picture of the world that is painted for us in Mark chapter 5 should be one that's rather familiar to us. It's exactly the same world that we live in today. In the stories that we're reading, we see people whose lives that are severely broken by the consequences of sin that entered into the garden through Adam and Eve. While I was studying, I found this statement that pretty much sums up the passage that we're looking at today. It says, Jesus came for those who have fame and for those who live in shame. Jesus will receive you whether you are respected or rejected or somewhere in between. Specifically, what we're looking at is how much Jesus values the life of a man, a woman, and a child living in the midst of the fallen world. As we've been walking through the Gospel of Mark, we've been learning that Jesus is both a servant and a Savior. We've seen that Jesus cares for the people as a group, and we also see that He cares for us as an individual. We've also established that Jesus, He is Lord over nature and that He is Lord over the forces of Satan. And today we're going to see that He is Lord over disease and death. The last time we were in the book of Mark, we saw that Jesus had delivered a man who had lived in the graveyard. He was bent on and destroying himself and under the influence of Satan's minions. After Jesus delivers him, he's told to stay in that town to live on mission, witnessing to his family and his friends and his neighbors. And then we pick up as Jesus comes back across that lake. Verse 21 gives us kind of a setting for the story, if you will. Please, if you would, follow along with me. The Bible says, "And when Jesus was passed over again by ship unto the other side, much people gathered unto him, and he was nigh unto the sea." Now, this crowd was probably waiting for Jesus as he returned from the other side of the lake. And in the middle of all of these people wanting to see this phenomenon that was Jesus, there were some that truly believed that Jesus was who he was proclaiming to be, and we see examples of their faith. With the crowds pressing in on him, in verse 22 we see, it says, "And behold, there cometh one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet." Now we're given the name of this man, and it turns out that he is a rather important man in their society. Jairus, it comes from the word Jair, and is taken from one of Israel's judges and means Jehovah enlightens. That this man who had some fame, he set aside all that, and he falls humbly at the feet of Jesus. He's in the middle of a crisis, and he needs help that only Jesus can provide. We see that his child is on the verge of death, and if that was going to change, something needed to happen rather quickly. You can almost hear the agony and the urgency in his voice in verse 23. It says, and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be well and live." You know, just because we have money, a title, or fame, it does not make us exempt from problems. This dad calls his girl my little daughter. You know, I understand the concern as a dad of my own amazing daughter. But we know from Luke's account that she was an only child and that she was in a very bad way, that she was dying. You know, Jairus, he may have heard of Jesus performing miracles. He maybe even have seen some of them. But whatever it was, he was confident that Jesus would go and touch his daughter and that she would be healed. Look at Jesus' response in verse 24. It says, "And Jesus went with him, and much people followed him and thronged him." Jesus, he immediately goes to help this man. But on the way, the people are still thronging, they're pressing in tight around him, probably hoping to catch a stray word or to see something that could change their lives. Now, almost as soon as we're introduced to Jairus, we meet another woman, another person, a woman that don't know her name. She just comes out of nowhere. The Bible does give us some sad details about her condition. In verse 25, we see that she was suffering. It says, "And a certain woman which had an issue of blood for 12 years. The word for issue is the word flowing, and it shows us that she was hemorrhaging or most likely suffering from anemia. Verse 26 said that she had suffered many things of many physicians. Now, it's kind of interesting that Luke, writing about this same story, kind of leaves that part out and just gives basic details and said that she could not be healed by anyone. I would say that the reason is because doctors back then, they trusted sorcery more than science. They would experiment with all these crazy concoctions or things for them to do. They would like mix owl brains, frog livers together. Some even believe that you could cure the common cold by kissing a mule. So these doctors had put her through a lot, and she was still suffering. We also see that she was spiritually unclean. Leviticus 15:25 tells us that a discharge of blood would have made her unclean and not able to gather with everyone in worship. Also, anyone who touched her would be unclean as well. So as a result, she was shunned. She lived a lonely life. We also see that she had spent all of her money. Verse 26 says that she was broke and was nothing better, but rather grew worse. And her disease had left her without any money. She had tried everything and spent all that she had. I would say that some of you could relate to this lady's position today. We also see that she was seeking help. Verse 27 says, when she had heard of Jesus, came in the press behind and touched his garment. The word for heard means to hear with attention. The healing power of Jesus, it gave her hope. But she knew that there was no way that she was going to be able to approach him face to face. She was ashamed, too ashamed to do that. The best that she could hope for was that maybe there was some secret healing if she could just touch him. Verse 28 tells us she was thinking that very thing. She says, if I may touch but his clothes, I shall be made whole. Luke tells us that she grabbed onto the fringe of his cloak. And as soon as she touched the garments, verse 29 tells us that straightway the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt it in her body, and she was healed of that plague. I love that this happened immediately, and she could tell that she was better. I wonder if she just kind of eased back into the crowd, saying, I'm good to go, everything's taken care of now. But verse 30, it tells us what happens next. It says, and Jesus immediately, knowing in himself that virtue had gone out of him, turned him unto the press and said, who touched my clothes? Now Jesus, he knew exactly who touched him, but he asked the question for the benefit of this lady. I can think of 3 reasons why Jesus might have done that. First of all, I think it gave her the opportunity to give her testimony of what Jesus had done. You know, belief on Christ is a very personal decision, but it also must be made public. And that's one of the reasons why we baptize. It gives us the opportunity to publicly identify with Christ. Also, I think it gave her the opportunity to build her belief and to guard her faith. And I also see that it showed the crowd that she was now clean and could be accepted back into their society. Her shame was now gone. You know, the disciples then responded to Jesus in verse 31. They said, thou seest the multitude thronging around thee, and sayest thou, who touched me? This shows once again that they just don't get it. They're impatient and don't understand what just happened. You know, we can be that same way sometimes, not understanding what God is doing or impatient for him to do something. Verse 32 tells us that Jesus went through the motions of searching for the woman. It says, and he looked around about to see her that had done this thing. Then in verse 33, we see that she is fearing and trembling, knowing what was done in her, came and fell down before him and told him all the truth. She's terrified because she knows that she should not have been anywhere in that crowd because she was unclean. She shouldn't have been around that many people, let alone touch Jesus' clothes. Now don't miss what happens next. This somewhat famous man, he falls down before Jesus. And then now this woman with shame falls down as well. Listen, it doesn't matter who you are or what position you hold. Your posture before Christ must be a broken humility and deep reverence. Again, Jesus came for those who have fame and for those who live in shame. And we are to humble ourselves before our Creator and our Redeemer. Verse 34 tells us that she wasn't just healed, but she was also saved. And he said to her, Daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace, and be whole of thy plague. He calls her daughter. He does this because she has just entered the family of God through her faith. She goes from living with shame, having no name, to being a daughter of the King. For 12 terrible years, she's been a nobody, and now she's a somebody. It was her faith that made her well. Not something special about Jesus' clothing. It was her faith. The word well is translated as saved in other passages and means to be kept safe and sound. She's told to go in peace and to be healed of her disease. She was delivered from her sickness and her sin. After this woman is healed physically and spiritually, we see in verse 35 that some messengers come from Jairus' house and tells him, they say, Thy daughter is dead, why troublest thou the master any further? I can't imagine what Jairus must have been thinking. Maybe if Jesus wasn't interrupted by this woman, he could have already healed my daughter. This delay is just taking too much time. Why couldn't Jesus have come back later and healed this woman? After all, she'd been sick for 12 years. What could a little more time matter? You may have heard this saying that God is never too late, He's seldom early, He's always on time. Things may not happen on our time schedule or how we want them to, but God can be trusted in His timing and in His methods. The question is, are you okay with His divine delay? When God delays, it doesn't mean that He doesn't care. Instead, it means He is performing His will in such a way that His delay will give God a greater glory for Himself and a greater faith for us. Well, we're told this in Romans 8:28. It says, And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to His purpose. Delays are really part of God's divine design, and interruptions are part of God's schedule for us. Moving on, we can see the tenderness that Jesus had in verse 36, because He knows this ruler would probably start falling apart at this news. He says, Be afraid, only believe. Literally, He's saying, keep on believing, keep on trusting, stop fearing, only believe. Jesus was calling him to have a continued faith in spite of what seemed like an impossible fact. Jesus, he then is finally able to thin out the crowd in verse 37. It says, And He suffered no man to follow Him, save Peter and James and John, the brother of James. There are 3 things that you would see in Middle Eastern funerals from that time period. People would tear their clothes. They would hire professional mourners, and there would be at least 2 people playing funeral songs on flutes. Funerals were filled with loud weeping and wailing and hand clapping. And that's the scene that Jesus comes upon in verse 38. It says, And He cometh to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and seeth the tumult, and them that wept and wailed greatly. The next thing that Jesus says is an important doctrine that we are taught as Christians. He defines death as just a temporary condition for anybody that is a believer. Look at verse 39. It says, And when He was come in, He saith unto them, Why make ye this ado and weep? The damsel is not dead, but sleepeth. For the believer, death is only temporary sleep. 1 Corinthians 15 verses 51 through 52 says, Behold, I shew you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump, for the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. When Jesus said she was sleeping, everyone starts laughing at Jesus. Luke tells us that they all knew that she was dead. In verse 40, we see that they laughed Him to scorn. That word, laugh Him to scorn, that word means to ridicule, to deride. This kind of laughter is by someone who thinks they know better or are superior. We shouldn't be surprised when people laugh at us or make fun of our faith in this manner. If they laughed at Jesus, they're going to do it to us. And while the people are laughing, Jesus, He then clears them out forcibly, much like He did the money changers in the temple. And then he tenderly puts his arm around the parents and leads them into the house. We see that tender spirit again in verse 41 when he says, "And he took the damsel by the hand and said unto her, Talitha cumi," which is, being interpreted, "Damsel, I say unto thee, arise." Jesus, he gently takes her hand, just like he did for Peter's mother-in-law in Mark chapter 1. And then Mark tells us he used the Aramaic phrase, which literally means, "Little lamb, arise." Continuing in verse 42, it says, "And straightway the damsel arose and walked, for she was of the age of 12 years, and they were astonished with a great astonishment." She was immediately healed, and those who witnessed this miracle were literally astonished. Jesus, he then makes sure to give the family some privacy. Verse 43 says, "And he charged them straitly that no man should know it, and commanded that something should be given to her to eat." Jesus again shows his compassion, even to the smallest details, asking that they give her something to eat. This shows us that he cares about all our needs, including a missed meal. So what can we learn from these stories today? First of all, start seeing interruptions in your life as God's appointment. When things don't go as planned, ask God to help you not to be irritated, but to see why he interrupted you and what he wants you to do. Secondly, see people as Jesus did. He didn't care if the person was rich or poor. Again, Jesus came for those who have fame and for those who live in shame. Thirdly, from the lady's story, we can learn to stop fearing and start having faith. See your problem as God's opportunity to work in your life. I like this quote from A.W. Tozer. It says, "As God is exalted to the right place in our lives, 1,000 problems are solved all at once." Fourthly, don't wait for a crisis before you commit yourself to Christ. Reach out to Jesus in faith and ask him to deliver you. Both Jairus and that woman, they had some things in common. They were both hopeless, and they both humbled themselves, and they knew where to go for help. They fell down at the feet of Jesus. When Jesus came in contact with the diseased and the dead, technically he should have been declared unclean. But just the opposite happened. Jesus used his purity to change their impurity. In that same way, Jesus' blood that was shed on the cross, it cleanses those who have been converted. Our wretchedness is exchanged for his righteousness. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, "For our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." Jesus, he wants to give you a new nature through a new birth. He'll give you a new name to blot out that shame. Are you ready today to become a daughter of Son of God? John 1:12 says, "But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become sons of God, even to them that believed on his name." Once you receive him, he'll look at you and call you son or daughter as you have been accepted into that family. This morning, if you've never been spiritually healed by him, I want you to come. Take care of that before it's too late. Also, I don't know what you're going through today, but I encourage you to seek out the greatest physician. Trust him in your life and look to see what he's trying to do.